A gute Woche. The Rebbe Zolgezonsen began the Farbrengen this afternoon that it is Shabbos, and Bechlal, Shabbos unites Yidden in general. And he brought the example that in the times when Yidden had to be careful with Trumas and Meiseres, eating foods only which Truma and Meiser was already taken off. So, al pi halacha, if there was Truma, which we were in doubt whether the Truma and Meiser was taken off this Truma, off this food, or wasn't. So comes Shabbos, Yerushalmi tells us that even in Am Oretz, whom we do not trust all week long, we trust him on Shabbos when he says that this food is edible. In other words, that Trumas and Meiseres was taken off this food. What does this show us? This shows us that Bechlal on Shabbos, there's a tremendous unity amongst all Yidden, regardless what type of Yid it is. It comes to Shabbos, we give everyone trust, and we trust every Yid. Memela, this brings about a unity amongst Yidden. So Memela, the fact that Yidden are gathering on a Shabbos, Yidden are together on a Shabbos, which is the idea of a Farbrengen, is something outstanding in itself. However, not every Shabbos is there a Farbrengen. There are some Shabbos when there is reason for Farbrengen, and other Shabbos when there is no Farbrengen. Today, which is the Shabbos, 20 days in the month of Av, and we are gathering to Farbreng, and we know the greatness of a gathering of 10 people, of Asara Yisrael. How much more so is it when there are 100 gathered? And how much yet greater is it when it is not only a gathering of 100, but it is a gathering of 1,000. And furthermore, the inyanim that are going to be discussed and spoken about at this Farbrengen, this is not inyanim which is just going to, everyone participating in the Farbrengen is just going to remain holding these inyanim for himself. Hopefully and definitely these inyanim will be shared with other Yidden as well. Once these inyanim are shared with other Yidden, then it will probably reach to a number of 10,000. And we find in Mishnah a machlekes between Rabbi Yossi Haglili and the other Tanoim, benegei birchas hamazon, benegei benching. When we bench, and at the meal there's a presence of 100 people or 1,000 people or so, Rabbi Yossi Haglili claims that for each one of these groups, as the group increases, we say a different text in the benching, in the beginning of the benching, in the introduction to the benching. The halacha is not so, but this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. The largest group which Rabbi Yossi Haglili mentions is a special text if it is in the presence of 10,000 people. So we see al pi halacha, 10,000 is already the largest group which we can be talking about in terms of halacha. So ultimately, these inyanim which will be discussed in today's Farbrengen will reach to even a mispar of revava, which is 10,000 as well. Though on one hand, the Rebbe went on, actually the reason for today's Farbrengen, which is the passing away of his father, the yortzeit of his father 40 years ago, on one hand, it is a personal inyan, which has a shaykhus to him, to the Rebbe personally, because this is the day of the yortzeit of his father. However, we are talking about tzaddikim. And Memele, Zayah tells us, and it's discussed a lot in Chassidus, that a tzaddik, once he passes away from this world, ishtakach yater mi bechayehu. His chus on this world, on the people left over in this world, is even yet greater. He guards his people that are left in this world even yet more than while he was alive. And here the Rebbe quoted the Yerushalmi, that there's a Yerushalmi that tells us Omar Rabbun, that's the name of the person who says this, the Tana, that there are some people who are given a shorter amount of years on this world. However, they are successful in accomplishing in this shorter amount of years what it takes other people to accomplish in many, many more years. Here the Rebbe referred to an inyan which he spoke about, Chamishasa B'Av, that it is brought in Sefer HaMinhagim, which is a Kabbalah Sefer. And there he talks about Tisha B'Av, and he says that Tisha B'Av, in the afternoon, when Tisha B'Av in the afternoon, was the height of the Chum, that was when the Beis HaMikdash was burning burning with great flames. He says that is a moment of simcha, a moment of joy. And it's brought in Sefer HaMenhagim, which is an authentic Sefer. In fact, the Magen Avram, who's a recognized Pesach, and we all go according to the Magen Avram, quotes the Sefer HaMenhagim at many, many occasions. And here he says something which is obviously requires a lot of interpretation. How can he say that when we're talking about such a time of Tisha B'Av, and he says that this is a time of Simcha? So the explanation is that as the steps were getting closer to the Churban HaBayis, really it began on Asara B'Teves. That is when the entire city of Yerushalayim was surrounded. Then it stepped further, was on Shivasa B'Tammuz. Shivasa B'Tammuz, Chazal tell us, Hufka Ha'ir. That is when the city, they bursted into the city, they broke the wall surrounding Yerushalayim, and that's when they broke into Yerushalayim. And as it gets closer and closer, until finally on Tisha B'Av, that is when they put the Beis HaMikdash on fire and flames. The mere fact that it was only the Beis HaMikdash, and not Chas v'Shalom on Klal Yisrael, this has to arouse within us an inyan of Simcha. As Chazal say, Kilach HaMasoi, Be'etzim u'Ba'avonim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu let out His temper only on the stones and on the rocks, and not Chas v'Shalom on anyone else. Could have been Chas v'Shalom much worse. So that's why he says this is a moment of simcha. Because we appreciate the fact that the Rebishter did not harm Chas v'Shalom any Yidden. It was only the Beis HaMikdash, which is Eitzim v'Avonim. But nothing more than that. Memela, we have the inyan of Tisha B'Av. On one hand, it's Tisha B'Av. And that is why, when do we say Nachem in davening? We say a Tisha B'Av by Mincha, because Nachem is an expression of condolence. In other words, this is required at the moment when it's the highest peak of the Churban, which that is Tisha B'Av in the afternoon. We do not say Nachem Tisha B'Av morning or before Tisha B'Av. When do we say Nachem? Tisha B'Av to Mincha, because that is when we need a Nechama, because that is when the Beis HaMikdash was really burning and the flames were strong and high. But on the other hand, it is an expression of Simcha, as it's brought in the Sefer HaMenhagim, for the fact that it was only the Beis HaMikdash and not Chas v'Shalom, something which is more than that, naturally referring to Yidden. The same the Rebbe goes on, Chazal tell us that Misas Tzadikim, the passing away of Tzadikim, is compared to Sreifas Beis Elokeinu. We compare that just like to the Churban HaBayis. Memela, on one hand, it is Taka an inyan, which arouses an inyan of tzar, especially those close ones to the tzaddik that passed away. Physically, they will definitely be missing him. He's not around anymore. But on the other hand, it is compared to the inyan of Beis HaMikdash. And just like by Beis HaMikdash, we find both of these nekudos. On one hand, it's an inyan of tzar, but on the other hand, it arouses an inyan of simcha. The same thing is the passing of a tzaddik, as explained in Zohar and in Kabbalah and in Chassidus, that the inyan of Misas Tzadikim, also just mentioned earlier, this brings about an inyan that tzaddik, the Rebbe quotes the Zohar in the Geras HaKodesh, that tzaddikim, the ispater mahai alme, tzaddik who was nifta from this world, is shtakich yater mebechayehu. He's really around and guarding Yidden and being melamed zchus on Yidden and helping out Yidden in this world even more when he was yet alive. Which this is the positive inyan, the inyan of simcha, which is the other part of the inyan of Misas Tzadikim. Then the Rebbe went on that we find by every tzaddik that first and foremost they excelled in an inyan that had a shayches to ktanim b'Yisrael, to youngsters. Youngsters in age as well as youngsters in knowledge. And this was the main goal of every tzaddik, to help out, to assist spiritually these youngsters and see to it that they get a proper chinuch. And we find this by the very first Nasi b'Yisrael, by Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, who was born as a Nasi, Moshe had the talents of a Nasi in him as he was born. Chazal tell us, based on the pasuk of Moshe Hoya Hoya, originally he was born as a shepherd, to be a shepherd for Klal Yisrael. And Chazal relate that before Moshe Rabbeinu was appointed to be a Nasi b'Yisrael, he was in charge of a group of sheep. And amongst the sheep which Moshe Rabbeinu was taking care of, there were sheep of all ages. Younger ones, older ones, middle age, and so forth. It happened once that one of the young sheep of Moshe Rabbeinu ran away from the rest of the sheep. So Moshe Rabbeinu made it his business and ran all over and searched and looked and found until he finally found this little sheep that ran away and returned it to the rest of the sheep. When the Rabbeinu Shalom realized this and saw this, he said, this shows how Moshe Rabbeinu has within him the proper talents and the proper acts of a Nasi b'Yisrael. Because this is the whole inyan of a Nasi b'Yisrael. A Nasi is supposed to care for each and every one of the Yidden. And as we see it in this incident, Moshe expressed special care for a youngster. And we find it right away as soon as Moshe Rabbeinu assumed leadership. When he came to Paroi and he requested that the Yidden go out of Mitzrayim, what did Moshe Rabbeinu say? B'noreinu u'bizkeneinu neilach. We will go with our young and with our old. What was the very first word that Moshe Rabbeinu said? With whom are we going? B'noreinu. His first concern was that Paroi release Klal Yisrael, but which part of Klal Yisrael did Moshe Rabbeinu concern himself with right away? B'noreinu, with our youngsters. And furthermore, the Rebbe says, could very well be, would have Moshe Rabbeinu not requested that the youngsters go, then Paroi would have agreed. And as we find in Chumash, what did Paroi say? L'chuna hagvarim, let the adults go. The adults could go, kansha dibartem, like you yourself said, that what are you going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu? You're going to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, let the adults go. However, to let the youngsters go, this is what Paroi was against. Moshe Rabbeinu, on the other hand, expressed a firmness and said, without our youngsters, we're not going. Quoting this pasuk, l'chuna hagvarim, let the adults go. Kansher amartem, like you have said. Here the Rebbe went into another inyan. The Rebbe said, Paroi, who stands for the inyan of the Yetzer Hara, the Sitra Acha, Paroi is quoting Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, he's saying, let the adults go, like you said. Like you yourself have requested. In other words, he's going along partially on their request, and he's saying, let the adults go. And this is what we find many times. The Rebbe says that it is famous quotation from the Frierdiker Rebbe, that the Yetzer Hara at times doesn't always appear like a Yetzer Hara. At times he appears in the format of Torah. He appears as he's following the Derech HaTorah, and with such a way it is easier for him to utilize his influence on Yidden. The Rebbe went into the inyan that Yidden are constantly begging, Ad Masai, how much longer are we going to be in Galus? Enough for Galus. Let the Rabbeinu Shalom already take us out of Galus. Let him send Mashiach Tzidkenu and take us out of Galus. And this is what we say every day in davening. Esemach David Avdecha meheiras hatzmiach v'karnoi torem b'shuasecha. We request constantly that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send us Mashiach Tzidkenu and take us out of Galus. In the Ani Mamins, we express that we constantly believe the coming of Mashiach. And we are constantly hoping for Mashiach to come. And here the Rebbe says, a Chabadnik is approached, and he's questioned. Who tells you to teach that we are constantly hoping for the coming of Mashiach? And Mashiach will come now. It is not our inyan to dictate Mashiach when to come. We say, we are expecting him whenever he will come. That means whenever he will come, whenever he will see it suitable that he will come, that is when we will be glad what is coming. But where do you see an inyan in begging HaKadosh Baruch Hu to rush Mashiach, that Mashiach should come fast? And the Rebbe says, surprisingly, when the Chabadnik is confronted with such a question, he remains without any answer. And he's surprised, because we have gone through this many times at many Farbrengens. We say constantly in davening, 3 times a day, Esemach David Avdecha meheiras hatzmiach. Send us speedily the coming of Mashiach. And if we should ask a 5-year-old child, what is the taich of Meheira? He will tell you right away that Meheira does not mean who knows when. Meheira means we're asking for the coming of Mashiach right away. Hasten the coming of Mashiach. Just for 10 seconds. No. However, if we want to interpret the proper taich of Meheira we can interpret in halacha. There's an expression miyad. The Rambam uses the expression many times. In halacha it is used miyad. Miyad means immediately. This is the very same what Meheira means. Meheira means immediately. And when we're asking for the coming of Mashiach, it means we ask that Mashiach should come immediately. In halacha there are inyanim of kedei mahalach mil, as long as it takes to walk a mil, which may be 15 minutes or 20 minutes, or such type of shiurim. But it does not mean that we want the coming of Mashiach, that when Mashiach will come, whenever it will be, we will be happy with it. Beferish not. Chazal tell us that there's an inyan in Achishena. Achishena means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu rushes the coming of Mashiach. So we beferish see that there is an inyan in Chazal and Gemara, that, and this is what Yidna mispalel for and beg for, that we begging HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he should rush the coming of Mashiach. Furthermore, a Yid davens mincha and says, "Semach David Abdecha Meheras Atzmiach." It says the bracha, Shemu Malchus, mentioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, comes to Ma'ariv, which is a Tfilas Rishos, which is only a few hours apart from the mincha, very short time apart from mincha. He again repeats the same request, and this is what Anshe Knesset Hagdolah have instituted in our Seder HaTfilah, that we are constantly begging for the coming of Mashiach. One will say we are already 1900 years in Galus, and we have survived in Galus, and therefore we can wait till Mashiach will come. How is it when we're talking about a physical recovery which one needs, one who needs a refuah? Will one say that if we need a refuah, and being that we didn't get the refuah till now, we will wait, and we can wait for a period of 1900 years? Nobody would ever say that. It's ridiculous to think that way. So why, when we're talking about the spiritual refuah which you need, which is taking us out of Galus, there are those that take such an easy attitude to it, and when they're questioned, even don't think for a moment to give a proper answer. And the truth is that those who are raising these questions also don't mean it. Because the truth is, let everyone do tshuva, not be lazy, and do tshuva. And Chazal promises that if all of Klal Yisrael does tshuva, then Mashiach comes immediately. And this is Mashiach. There's a Chazal, the Rebbe quoted, that Mashiach himself is sitting and waiting, impatiently, waiting when will already be the moment when he will be able to come. The only thing, he didn't have to do tshuva, he didn't have to prepare himself. And Chazal tell us, once Klal Yisrael does tshuva, then Mashiach comes right away. Then the Rebbe went on, continued that it is Shabbos, 20 days in the month of Av, and it is 40 years since the passing of his father, 40 years since Rabbi Levi Yitzchak passed away. Then it says in Shabbos we find various levels. There's the day of Shabbos. Prior to the day of Shabbos comes the evening of Shabbos. There's also the afternoon of Shabbos. In fact, the afternoon of Shabbos, which is the preparations which one does for Shabbos, is very important. The first siman in the Shulchan Aruch of Hilchos Shabbos discusses the details which one is required to do on Erev Shabbos, which is the preparations of Shabbos. The davening which we daven Friday night, when we say the L'cha Doidi, it seems, the Rebbe says, that in times of Gemara, this was recited Friday afternoon. And also the Arizal, it is brought that Al Pi Kabbalah, there were many that would recite this Friday afternoon. As an introduction to L'cha Doidi, we have 6 kapitlach of Tilem, which come before the L'cha Doidi. What is the first kapitel of Tilem? The first kapitel begins with L'chuna Ranan al Hashem. What do we find in L'chuna Ranan al Hashem? The Rebbe expressed himself. We have a pasuk. Arbayim shana akut b'daya. So we have an inyan which reminds us on Arboim, on the Mispar Arboim, the Mispar of 40, which has a shaykhs to 40 years of the Yotzeit of the Rebbe's father, which is commemorated on this Shabbos. And this is a pasuk which we say as an introduction to the Shabbos. Naturally, there are those that are going to immediately comment that this pasuk talks about the 40 years which the Yidden spent in the Midbar. Memela, it is not a positive inyan, it's an unwanted inyan. So there's a Gemara Masechta Sanhedrin. There's a Gemara Masechta Sanhedrin where the Gemara quotes this pasuk. And the Gemara interprets how this pasuk has a shaykhs to the times of Mashiach. This is how Gemara and Rashi interpret this pasuk. The Marsha comments on this Gemara that we do not have to look too far to find the shaykhs. To find the shaykhs between this pasuk and the coming of Mashiach. And the Rebbe says we're talking about the Marsha. We're talking about the Marsha, and there's a saying from the Rebbe Rashab, from the Rebbe Nishmaseiden, in the Hemshech of Tafchei Shayim Beis, where he tells us that all the Sfarim, all the accepted Sfarim, which were written until the Marsha, were written with Ruach HaKodesh. The Marsha says we don't have to go far to find the shaykhs between this pasuk and Mashiach. If we look a little bit earlier into this kapitel, there's a pasuk Hayoim B'Koilei Sishmo, and this pasuk has a shaykhs to Mashiach and obvious shaykhs, because Chazal tell us that Mashiach was asked when is he going to come, and Mashiach responded Hayoim, today. A period passed and he didn't come, then he was questioned again. How does it agree to what you just said? You said that you're going to come Hayoim. So he said, yes, he means the pasuk Hayoim and B'Koilei Sishmo. Immediately as Yidden will listen to the voice of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that Hayoim Mashiach will come. So the Mashal says, so we see how obvious that these psukim here talk about Mashiach. And also the expression is Arbaim Shana Okut B'Doyer. Okut is from the word Nokat, holding on, something tangible which we can hold on to. So Mamela, here we're talking about the inyan of Bias HaMashiach in the sense of an Okut, in the sense of Okut B'Dayah, which means in a way which is tangible, mamish, holding on to the coming of Mashiach, to Mashiach. So here we have an open shaykhs between the Shabbos and the fact that today is 40 years from the passing of the Rebbe's father, and it's spelled out right away in the introduction to Shabbos, where we say the very first kapitel, which we say in L'chuna Ranana, or we say Arbaim Shana Okut B'Dayah. Later in the Farbrengen came to learn a Rashi in this week's Sedre, as well as the Mishnah and Pirkei Avos for this week. The Rebbe always tied all these inyanim into a shaykhs of Arboim, of number 40. In fact, mentioned earlier in the Farbrengen, that we find in this week's Sedre and Parshas Eikev, right away at the beginning, the inyan of Arboim is mentioned several times. And therefore, the Rebbe says it's appropriate that the Rashi, which we will learn in today's Sedre and Parshas Eikev, is also one that has a shaykhs to the inyan of Arboim. The Rebbe raised questions on the Rashi in Kapitel Ches, Pasuk Beis. Pasuk tells us, "V'zachartas kol haderech asher yilichacha Hashem Elokecha." We should remember the entire way which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has taken us. Zeh arbaim shana, for a period of 40 years Bamidbar. Carried us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has taken us through the deserts, a period of 40 years. Leman anoischa l'nasoischa. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu do this? To test us. Ladas eis asher bilvavcha, to know what is in our hearts. Hasishma mitzvaysav, will we observe to the mitzvahs? Im loya, wouldn't we? Pashtus, how do we teach Hasishma mitzvaysav? As we just said, would we observe the mitzvahs? Rashi teaches different. Let us look into the Rashi on Pasuk Beis. Rashi says, Shaloi tenasehu, not to test HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'loi taharer achav, and not to think after him. Obviously, it's a glata pasuk. Why is there any need for Rashi Bichlal to say any comment, to say anything? And let us teach simply Hasishma mitzvaysav. And Rashi, we see, does not teach Hasishma mitzvaysav, will we listen to the mitzvahs? Rashi teaches Hasishma mitzvaysav, will we not test HaKadosh Baruch? The emes is, we have similar psukim in Chumash. There's a pasuk in Pashas Bishalach, which is very similar. Also a pasuk which uses this expression, Laman anasenu, pasuk in Kapitel Tezayim, pasuk Daled, in Shemois. Laman anasenu hayelach b'serasi imloi. Rabbi says he will test the Yidden if they will observe the Torah, and there Rashi right away says, if they will listen to the mitzvahs. To the mitzvahs that are dependent on the man. There the pasuk is talking about the man. So what does Rashi teach? Hayelach b'serasi. If they will follow the mitzvahs that they are commanded to regarding the man, how they should take the man and so forth. We have another pasuk which gets involved with the 40 years that the Yidden won the Midbar, and that is at the very end of Pashas Kisavai. The very end of Pashas Kisavai, there the Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu is also summarizing what has happened throughout the 40 years. And he says, the great things which you have seen. And I've carried you your clothing did not spoil. And you didn't have no food, you were fed by the man. There again, Rashi interprets Ad Hayom Hazeh, and Rashi gets involved and tells us that being that was at the end of the 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu was referring to the fact that it takes a person 40 years, ein Adam oimed al das Rabbi, until it passes 40 years. Once 40 years have passed, then they have a deeper understanding and realization what the Rebbe has done to them. Here Rashi does not say that. Here Rashi only teaches what is the meaning of Hasishma mitzvaysav. You shall not test HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not think after him. Why is it that Rashi is forced in Pshutei Shel Mikro to teach here different than the Glatik Pshat would be? Hasishma mitzvaysav, will you listen to the mitzvahs of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So the Rebbe is explaining, this pasuk here, Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about the man which the Yidden were fed with. And he's expressing himself, refer to the way which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has taken you, remember, you're already 40 years in the Midbar. There's an expression, Chassidus always quotes the Chazal, one is pinpointing, zeh. Look, see. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is taking back the Yidden for a period of all of the 40 years, and going through the 40 years, and see what happened throughout these 40 years. First of all, the Yidden began receiving the man at a time before they had the Torah. So Memela, we cannot teach Hasishma mitzvaysav as far as mitzvahs are concerned, because the man began before mitzvahs. Immediately a month after the first year that the Yidden were out of Mitzrayim, they already had man. So the man came before. Even when they got the Torah, there were many, many mitzvahs which the Yidden didn't have until later years. For example, the Rebbe mentioned just a few. The mitzvahs of Giulei Nochem, Giulei Kalim, all the dinim how we're supposed to kasher Kalim, from non-kosher to kosher. This came in the last year, in the 40th year. The same thing, all the dinim of nachla, of inheritance, when the problem aroused with the Bnei Slavchad, which aroused, alerted, brought about that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should tell all the dinim of nachla, of inheritance in Eretz Yisrael. When did this take place? This took place the 39th year of being in the midbar. So what do we see? That there were many mitzvahs which throughout the 40 years were not in existence. Moshe Rabbeinu is looking here to address the Yidden to a point. He wants to bring their attention to something which went on for the entire 40 years. Zer boim shana. Something from day one that they began receiving the man until here when Moshe Rabbeinu is about to pass away, which is almost 40 years. The Rebbe says the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away in Adar and the Yidden received the man, started receiving the man in Iyar, which does not give it complete 40 years. This is, we're not bothered with it. It can still be considered a period of 40 years. 40 years less 2 months is still 40 years. Memele, Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to prove that the Rebbe did it hasishma mitzvaysa. Shaloi tenasei, you shall not test him. What's the pshat shaloi tenasei? So the Ramban and other Mefarshei HaChumash explain us that really when the Rebbe took the Yidden out of Mitzrayim and took them through the Midbar into Eretz Yisrael, there were really many other ways which the Rebbe was able to take them to, without having to go through deserts. They could have gone through Eretz Plishtim. There were many inyonim which happened on the trip, on the way, while the Yidden were going from Mitzrayim to Eretz Yisrael, which could have aroused questions by the Yidden. For example, they were in the place which is called Shom Einois Moyim, Shivim Tmarim, a pasuk which we discussed a few weeks ago. They came to an area where they found water. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have left them in that area for a longer period of time and they would have had natural water without coming on to Nisim. The same thing, they were the Tagriyu Masailam. They were Goyish merchants who were traveling in the Midbar. And those merchants who were traveling, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have let the Yidden that they could have get involved and get regular food and consume it and buy it from these Goyish merchants who were traveling. So the Rebbe fed them in a miraculous way. He fed them with a man. So this is what Moshe Rabbeinu is trying to bring out. That throughout these 40 years, the Rebbe has tested you, hasishma mitzvaysav. So Rashi is learning this pasuk and sees the word hasishma mitzvaysav. And Rashi does not want to teach hatishma mitzvaysav referring to mitzvahs. So Rashi is looking, what could we teach this hatishma mitzvaysav to? And looking into the pasuk is talking about kol haderech asher lichach Hashem Elokecha, about the entire trip which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has taken us through. Zeh arbaim shana b'midbar. So Rashi is teaching, we must say that we must be referring to such type of nisyonos, which the Yidden could have complained on HaKadosh Baruch Hu's attitude while he was carrying them through the midbar, and the Yidden did not. So hasishma mitzvaysav, the Rebbe tested us. Shaloi tenasei, we shall not test HaKadosh Baruch. Rashi goes on, v'loi tahare rachav, and not to think after him. What does that mean? Because the pasuk uses the expression lo das eis asher bilvavcha, what is in your heart? What is the pshat in our hearts? In our hearts we have sometimes when we are meharer, when we think after somebody, this is a feeling which arouses in the heart. So that is why Rashi finds most befitting to teach the pasuk hasishma mitzvaysav shaloi tenaseu v'loi tahare rachav. Shaloi tenaseu, because we cannot apply it to mitzvahs in general. And the same thing, v'loi tahare rachav, not thinking after him, which applies to the bilvavcha and the pasuk. Rashi cannot teach here like Rashi teaches in Pashas Kisavai, that after 40 years one understands what his Rebbe deeper intentions of his what his Rebbe has taught him, because the pasuk is not talking here at what happened at the end of the 40 years. Moshe Rabbeinu is making a sachakel of all of the 40 years. Zeh boim shana. Once the 40 years have finished, then they come to a point of being koyem adaita derabe. However, once the 40 years did not finish yet, the beginning of the 40 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 and so forth, then they were not in a position of being koyem adaita derabe. And the pasuk here is talking about zeh boim shana, Moshe Rabbeinu is taking all of the 40 years together. Memele, he's talking about a time when they weren't able to be koyim adai to the Rabbi. He's talking about a time at the beginning or middle of the 40 years as well. That is why Rashi is forced to teach that what does it mean? It does not mean mitzvahs. It means a specific thing of not testing HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the way the Rebbe took them through the midbar. Weiter in Pashas B'Shalach, there were some mitzvahs which came even before Matan Torah. There were the mitzvahs which the Yidden had in Mara, or regarding mitzvahs which the Yidden had pertaining how they should act, which regarding to the man, which this was Shabbos, and Shabbos they were commanded on in Mara. So Mamela there in Pashas B'Shalach, Rashi is only referring to those mitzvahs which they were commanded before Matan Torah, and these are the mitzvahs which they were told in Mara. But in Mishnah, in this week's Perek, according to the Minhag, the Yesh Noyagin, that throughout all of the entire summer months, we learned Pirkei Avos, and today is the 5th Perek. The 5th Perek, there's an open shaykhs to the Inyan of Arboim. The Mishnah tells us, the last Mishnah of Perek Hamishi, tells us, Ben Arboim Lebina. Once somebody reaches age of 40, he comes to Bina, he comes to understanding. And here the Rebbe brought in a few pshatim. There's one pshat, which means that once a person reaches the age of 40, that is when he comes to a level of Bina. Just like Ben Esrim Lirdef and Bishloishim Lekoyach comes to Ben Arbayim, it is Labina. Another interpretation is as we saw from the Rashi, which we just discussed. It doesn't mean when he reaches the age of 40. It means 40 years after he has heard an Inyan from his Rebbe and he's puts himself into it, that is when he can come to a deeper understanding of it. Just like Rashi teaches at the end of Pashas Kisavai. There the Yidden didn't come to the age of 40. There it was after being 40 years in the midbar. Memela, the same can be applied to the concept of Ben Arbayim Labina. It can be taught both ways. And that is why the Rebbe says it is brought in Svarim. Svarim bring that one should not get involved into learning Kabbalah until he reaches the age of 40. Why? From this we see that 40 is a certain specialty. A person does have a different understanding when he comes to the age of 40. However, now we are fortunate that we have Limud HaChassidus. And what Limud HaChassidus does, it interprets Kabbalah, it explains Kabbalah. Chassidus is based to explain Kabbalah, and this is something which we can learn and understand. And then we have access to even at a younger age, before we reach the age of 40. The Rebbe says that there's a saying of Hasidim that Chasidus is even greater than Kabbalah. Though on one hand Chasidus explains Kabbalah, but it explains it and gives it to us in a way that we can all have a full and good understanding of all of these inyanim which Chasidus explains. Because this is the whole inyan of Chasidus, especially Chasidus Chabad, is to bring inyanim down into an understanding that we should be able to understand it with our Chachma Bina V'das. Here the Rebbe said that there's a vote from the Baal Shem Tov. And let me use the expression, it's a mavhildike vote. Mavhil would mean a scary vote. And it is a nifladike vote, a very outstanding vote. And the Rebbe says everyone can really take it his way. It can be taken as a mavhildike vote, and it can be taken as a nifladike vote. That it is related in behalf of the Baal Shem Tov, that the Baal Shem Tov was not satisfied that people should learn Kabbalah. Though on the other hand, the entire Torah Chassidus is based on explaining Kabbalah. It was in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe referred to that in Eretz Yisrael there is a convention going on, a convention of Shluchim. The convention of the Rebbe Shluchim is taking place in Eretz Yisrael this Shabbos. The Rebbe says that he sent them a letter, a greeting letter to this convention, and we know the great union of Shliches. The Rebbe says, came out to discuss at previous occasions, the union of a Shliach is that Shlucha Shel Adam Kemoisei Mamish, when one is appointed as someone's emissary, it is Mamish, like the one whom he is representing. There are various interpretations how strong the power of a Shliach is. But there's an interpretation that goes as far that is Mamish as the one who has sent him. whatever he does is considered like the Mishaleach does it. Rabbi says the contents of the letter which he wrote is not a contents of his own inyanim, it's also Divrei Torah, which is taken from the Torahs, from Rabbi Seinu Nisiyenu. And another inyan which is discussed, which the Rebbe says he did not add it into writing there, and it also has a shaykhs to this letter, is the fact that the month of Av is referred as the month of Mazal Aryeh. Every month has a shaykhs to a different Mazal. The month of Av has a shaykhs to the Mazal of Aryeh, a lion. But again we see how there's a shaykhs between the month of Av and the month of Elul. Because from Av we right away enter into Elul. Aryeh abbreviates Elul, Aleph, Elul. Reish abbreviates Rosh Hashanah. The Yud stands for Yom Kippurim. And the Hey at the end of Aryeh stands for Hoshayna Rabbah. Which these are all the serious days of which Elul comes as an introduction. And from Elul we go through all of these days of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Hoshayna Rabbah. And that is why also the word Aryeh, also if we take the same lettering, we get the idea of Yira. Fearing of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which this is what Chodesh Elul is all about. Chodesh Elul, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, this is all the idea of being Yirei Hashem. The Rebbe said that those shluchim that are here and are not in Eretz Yisrael, after Shabbos, if they will also be getting the same letter which was sent to the convention of shluchim in Eretz Yisrael, and also a bottle of mashke will be given tonight or tomorrow through the Rebbe's office to each one of the shluchim who are here present. And by taking this Gashmiistic thing from today's Farbrengen, and they will take this along with them, this will involve in a Ruchniistic level all those people whom they will distribute this mashke to whenever they will do it, and whenever they will get a chance to do it, that will bring those people, being the Mekasher, tying them together with the Farbrengen of this afternoon. But said, however, there are a few people present at the Farbrengen who were fortunate to assist his father when his father needed assistance. At the time his father was in Golus. We all know that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak in his last years was sent off into far Siberia for his work of Yiddishkeit in Russia. Early in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe quoted a chinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch tells us that when a person is sent into exile or sent into Golus, it is worse than Chas v'Sholem than passing away. So that we can imagine what kind of a torture it is for a person to be sent into Golus. And there are a couple of people present at the Farbrengen who they were fortunate they had the schos to be mishamesh, to make things easier, to be of service to his father. And the Rebbe says as a token of appreciation, he will give them the mashke during the Farbrengen. The Rebbe says, really, he should have been there, and he should have had the schos, should have been there physically, and he should have had the schos of being of service to his father and seeing whatever only possible, he should have helped his father. But for whatever reason, came out to be that physically he was not there, and Memela, he was not able to do it. So those that did it really did him a favor by representing him and seeing to it, alleviating his father from, and helping him whatever it was only possible to help. And therefore he appreciates it very much, and he's asking that he shouldn't have to call upon them twice, or go, everybody who was only present there should immediately come up. And the Rebbe, a couple of people who were present in the last years of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak came up to the Rebbe doing the Farbrengen, and the Rebbe gave each one of them, poured into a little bit of mashke. In fact, the Rebbe said he also has a bottle of mashke here, which comes from a Farbrengen in Russia. Mamela, what he will do is he will mix this mashke together with the mashke which he's giving them, and by that way he's associating those Yidden who are presently in Russia as well to this Farbrengen. The Farbrengen in these siches, the Rebbe was talking about the Nechama, which the 7 weeks of Nechama. In other words, now we go through a period from Shabbos Nachmu until Rosh Hashanah. The Haftarahs that are said are not said with the contents of the Haftarah that has a shaykhs to the Parshas HaShavua, but this is a Haftarah which is also an expression of nechama, an expression of condolence, which comes after the Churban HaBayis. The first one began with Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. The week after Shabbos Nachmu, what is the response of Yidden? In other words, how does the next Haftarah begin? V'atomer Tzion azavani Hashem, v'Hashem shcheichoni. Tzion says, Hashem has forgotten us, Hashem has left us. Why? Because Tzion and Yidden are unhappy. In other words, the Rebbe is explaining how all of these Haftarahs come as one sequence. In other words, Tzion is unhappy, Yidden, Knesset Yisrael are unhappy with the fact that the Nechama is coming not from the Rebishter himself, but it is coming through Nevi'im. And therefore, we come to the next Haftarah. The next Haftarah begins with Anoichi, Anoichi hu menachemchem. A double expression of Anoichi. We know that Anoichi is the definition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a very outstanding way. That is why HaKadosh Baruch Hu began the Aseres HaDibros with Anoichi. Anoichi, Chazal tell us, the Lo Yisrame is Lo B'Shum Mois, Lo B'Shum Koitz. It is a higher way of defining HaKadosh Baruch Hu, higher than in any one of his names. Comes here, when the Rebishter is expressing Nechama to what has happened by Churban HaBayis. The Rebishter uses the expression
what happened to Aniyah Sorah?
Happy. It also go on Aniyah Sorah Lo Nechama. Klal Yisrael have still not agreed to accept condolence, and after these 2 weeks, it arouses by HaKadosh Baruch Hu an expression of Anoichi, Anoichi hu menachemchem, a double Anoichi. In other words, it is even yet greater than the Gilu which happened by Matan Torah. By Matan Torah, it was only one Anoichi. Comes here, that is in Pasha Shoftim. We get a response from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Anoichi, Anoichi hu menachemchem, a double Anoichi, which shows on the strong kesher which comes about between the Rabbeinu Shalom and Yid. It is customary that during the Farbrengen the Rebbe also learns a halacha in Rambam which has a shayches to the Shia Rambam of that day. And again the Rebbe stressed what he spoke this past Sunday night in the Farbrengen, whereby the Rebbe is alerted and brought to our attention that it would be extremely advisable that a new sefer be published, bringing out all the sources of the Rambam's halachas. In a brief way, we should be, while the Rebbe says there are many sources to the halachas of the Rambam, which are spread all over many svarim, it would be extremely advisable. The Rebbe suggested Sunday night that the Koilel should undertake this task to gather and put together to print the source for every halacha in the Rambam. Halacha after halacha, to be able to track back which is the source of the Rambam, where the Rambam got this, not only in general the halacha, but all the details of the halacha which the Rambam tells us, which is the inyan of the Rambam. The sefer is halachas. A sefer should be made which should tell us all the sources of the Rambam. The Rebbe says he's extremely satisfied that work already has begun on the sefer since he spoke about it this past Sunday night. The Rebbe says those that are working in it should not be afraid of the task that they are doing, because if they will, once they publish one edition, definitely there will be room to add in Yonim in the next edition. In fact, those people whom the sefer will reach to, and they will have any comments on various sources to the halacha of the Rambam, he's sure, the Rebbe says, that they will not hold it back, and they will also put it into writing immediately and send it in to the proper address. And therefore, by doing this, it will bring to a complete sefer, which will give us a complete idea on each and every halacha of the Rambam, what is the source of this halacha, where it was taken from. In today's shiur of Rambam, it is in Hilchas Nedarim. By Nedarim, the Rebbe says, we find something outstanding, very special. Normally we know that there's an inyan of bar mitzvah. When does a yid become mechuyev to do mitzvahs? When he's 13 years old. 13 years old by a male, 12 years old by a female. By Nedarim we find something very special. That once somebody is age of 12, he has accepted upon himself a neder, the neder is a neder. It carries the validity of a neder, just like by a bar mitzvah. And the Rambam goes on explaining that by a 12-year-old, if we see him making nedarim, we should check him. We should see. If he is of proper understanding, his neder is a neder. Passes a little bit of time, he again makes a neder, check him out again. If again we notice that he's stable, he knows the child understands what he's doing, then his neder carries the validity of a neder. If not, it's not a neder. So the Rebbe really went into explain what is this thing going on here. Why is it different by nedarim than b'chol ha'Torah kula, than by all other dinim? And it is based on the fact that by nedarim we have an expression ki yafli. Torah keeps on using the expression ki yafli. One will wonder and make a neder. Pele actually, Rabbi used the expression, the Hasidic expression keser. We have often the expression in Hasidus. Keser means something which is above. Same would lend the same expression and interpret the idea of a yafli also. In other words, in general, the whole idea of nedarim is a strange idea. The Rishalmi tells us, Dayach b'mesha osrach Torah. Really, a person shouldn't accept additional nedarim upon himself. It is sufficient what the Torah has put upon us. Don't go and take more than the Torah has told you. Don't take upon yourself more than that. Memela, the whole idea of a neder is an inyan of a yafli, is an inyan of a pella. However, when one goes and does this pella and accepts this pella upon himself, we shall stick to this expression which the Torah uses, could be that today he's doing the right thing, especially when we're talking about one who has not reached age of 13 yet. However, when a little more time passes and he's still not bar mitzvah, and he again gets into a neder, being that we're talking about inyanim which are unusual inyanim, we're not talking about the regular frame of life. It's not the regular. See, in regular day-to-day life does not require acceptance of nedarim upon oneself. So Mamela, that is why the Rambam says it is appropriate to check out the child again and see, is he of a position to accept nedarim upon himself? Does he understand what he's doing, or he does not understand what he's doing? So the inyan of neder is really something yafli. It's an unusual type of a situation. In other words, the regular day-to-day life, there's no inyan of nedarim. Mamela, that is why we find by nedarim, the Torah has made this exception. And this does not mean that each and every neder which a 12-year-old will take upon himself has the validity of a neder. We check out the child throughout the year. Do we find him understanding what he's undertook upon himself? Then we let him go through with the neder. Then it carries the weight of a neder. Otherwise, it is no neder. I will explain this inyan ba'arichas. There's also a Radvaz, which is a commentary on the Rambam, which wants to tell us that the Rambam may have had a different girs in the Gemara regarding these things, and the Rebbe got involved in a detailed explanation saying that we are not forced to accept the opinion of the Radvaz. It is just because it all stems because the inyan of a neder is an unusual type of thing, and that is why here it requires special cautiousness, especially when we're talking about one who has not reached the age of 13. In other words, one who is really not a bar das yet. And the Farbrengen, the Rebbe very much alerted and begged for involvement in all of the miftzayim, listed each one of the miftzayim separately, also Miftzah Sefer Torah, and all of the miftzayim seeing. The Rebbe concluded the Farbrengen that the Seder which we're going to begin reading now begins with Re'ei Anochi Noisen Lefnechem Hayoim Bracha. That is the Seder which we began reading today, this afternoon by Mincha. So we should be zeicha that which should be get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu should be an inyan of bracha, but it should be given in the way of re'iyah, of vision. We know that there's a tremendous difference between re'iyah and shmiyah, vision and listening. In fact, early in the Farbrengen, the Rebbe explained it as well, and it's explained in Hasidus. Very strong. The effect, the impact vision has, seeing has, is in no way comparable to an impact which comes through hearing. Vision leaves a much stronger impression. And that is why it is brought in Sfarim that when Mashiach will come, Torah will be taught in a way of re'iyah. So that is what Rebbe is stressing here. Let us be zeicha to the period of time which we should be zeicha to, that Re'eya Neichi Neisim Lefnechem Hayoim Bracha, we should get bracha, but the bracha that we're getting should be in a format of Re'iyah. In other words, that we should be uplifted to a higher level, to the level of Re'iyah.
In general, throughout the entire Farbrengen, the Rebbe mentioned many inyonim that have a contact to the number of 40. For example, the Rebbe discussed the greatness of the man, which we learned earlier in the Rashi, and explained how the word man is based on the word ma, that the Yidden asked, what is it? And the major part of the word is also, again, the mem, which totals number 40. The Rebbe also discussed that regarding the letter mem, we have two kinds of mems. There is a mem psucha and a mem stuma, which is the regular mem, and what we would call the shloss mem, which comes at the end of the word. The Rebbe brought to our attention that we have in the davening of Musaf on Shabbos, when we recite Tikanta Shabbos, which is an aleph base backwards. In other words, the first word begins with Tikanta, which is the last letter of the aleph base. The second word is Shin, Shabbos, which is one letter before the last. And then we go letter after letter until we finally come to the letter Aleph. I will also pointed out that after we come to letter Aleph, we again have a repeat of several of the words. Oz nitztavu tzivuye poleo korohu, which these letters are repeated because these are the letters which are duplicated in the aleph base. For example, letter mem, which there are two mems as we just mentioned. The same would apply to letter nun, mem, and tzadik, and pei, and kaf, where we have a lang kaf. So rather than having 22 words which fit into the aleph base, in this case we would have 27 words because there are 5 additional words for resembling those letters who are repeated in the aleph base. Agutavach.